Warning, this video concerns only the book version of Catelyn Stark. I have not seen the TV show, and thus details and facts may differ. If you have only seen the show Game of Thrones, be aware of this discrepancy. This video will spoil all 5 A Song of Ice and Fire books, and thus likely several seasons of the show. I will be talking about a common book theory that is never confirmed in the books, but is confirmed in the show, at the end of Season 6 and beginning of Season 7. This video will also address things in A World of Ice and Fire that have not been addressed in Fire and Blood, although I personally do not believe any of the things I say are spoilery in nature for that novel. Catelyn Stark. Family, duty, honor. Born to House Tully of Riverrun, sister to Lysa and Edmure Tully. Betrothed to Brandon Stark of Winterfell, destined to marry Ned Stark instead. Mother of 5, stepmother of 1. Wise, stubborn, honorable, proud, and, if my comment section is to be believed, controversial. I had many surprises to discover through my first read of A Song of Ice and Fire years after it became and remained popular, but perhaps one of my biggest surprises was people's reaction to me saying that Catelyn was one of my favorite characters. And although throughout my reading of the series she did fall behind some characters like Jaime Lannister, my #1 fave, she did remain in my top 5 favorite characters throughout the entire published series. And despite the fact that other characters in my top 5 are hardly what I would consider saints, the pushback I received was all in regards to Catelyn Stark. So I just knew I had to set the record straight. My goal today is not to convince you that Catelyn is a great person, or to even convince you to make her a favorite character. My goal today is to perhaps help you view Catelyn through a different lens and understand why she means so much to me, as well as why she's such an important character in fantasy fiction. I'll see you after the jump. Although I will eventually get to specifics about Catelyn and her character arc and actions she makes in the novel, I do want to start this video off talking about more general things about Catelyn's character. And this deals with how motherhood in general is presented in fantasy, both in media for our youngest of viewers to adults. Honestly, I'm not sure I gave a lot of thought to the representation of mothers as I was growing up. My focus was always more on the more relatable characters to my age in my youth, which would have usually been the protagonists. And so for that reason, I think it may be similar for many of you, that especially if you are not a mother, you may never have sat down and given a lot of thought to that presentation. And ever since I became a mother, I have started giving it a lot of thought. And as I started looking, I started noticing a few things, and I started to wonder if these constant and repeated specific representations of motherhood started to shape our general opinion and ideas about motherhood, especially about how mothers should be presented in our fiction. And perhaps this started giving us a subconscious expectation when it comes to our literary parents. We are often presented with very diametric displays of motherhood. Either the character is self-sacrificing, always loving, the very definition of maternal motherhood, or we see the pure evil, the wicked and evil stepmother. That is, of course, if we get to see mothers at all, if they aren't dead. When we move into adult fiction, we often see something else. Stories that center around mothers usually can only do so if they are no longer mothering. Perhaps their children have grown up and are out of the home, or their children have died. Because how can a mother both be a mother and go on an adventure? How can a mother retain anything to her that is not defined within motherhood if there are still children around to mother? Fathers, on the other hand, can be misguided, absent, difficult, but ultimately can be forgiven for these traits when they come to learn about their children and come to an understanding. To be clear, these stereotypes can be frustrating for both sides. I'm sure it is very frustrating to always see bumbling, absent fathers presented in media and the unfair representation that often is. However, today we are focusing on Catelyn Stark, and so I will be focusing on our representation of motherhood. If we want to talk about fathers, we can do it in a different video. Considering this all together, we may struggle with Catelyn Stark because she does not fit neatly into the normal presentations of motherhood we are used to seeing in media. As Jimmy from the Fantasy Network so perfectly put it in our Parenthood in A Song of Ice and Fire Live,
Catelyn has a lot of good and a lot of bad. And that is why she's such a cool character, is because you talked about 2 different archetypes and she's both. She is the evil stepmother and also a wonderful mother in many aspects to her own children. She is a blending of the two.
Catelyn exists in this liminal space. She is not a perfect mother. While she is a fiercely loving and protective mother to her biological children, she cannot seemingly find any love in her heart for another child under her roof. We expect her to sacrifice everything for her children, but instead watch her make the decision to go to her husband's aid instead. She actively puts herself into political maneuverings and worries about her house's future. Like all of George Martin's mothers, she exists as a person outside of her role as a mother. Catelyn is just not a figure we see a lot in fantasy or just in media in general as a representation of motherhood, and it was why I was so drawn to her immediately. It reminds me a lot of how I was drawn to Misaki in one of my other favorite novels, Emma Wang's The Sword of Kaigan. Catelyn is a mother, but she still is a person and has retained other wants, desires, needs, and motivations. And I can't help but always be grateful when I see this type of representation. Because when a person becomes a mother, their old identity isn't completely stripped. They exist before and they will continue to exist afterwards. And I don't say that in a condescending way. I say it in a way that many people had to discover for themselves. When I became a mother and I had suddenly a lot of other mother friends, a lot of them expressed surprise that the expectations they had to be completely fulfilled only in the role of motherhood wasn't there, and that their other goals and dreams didn't suddenly disappear. Now, it's very complicated to talk exactly about how much media representation influences us. We know it does to some degree, but it's very hard to measure. However, I would like to posit that our representations of motherhood in the fantasy we consume as youth probably have influenced our idea of what we should be as a mother going forward. And in this way, it's why as an adult and a mother myself, I have come to appreciate and love these very nuanced views of motherhood that are present all over Martin's work. Let's get into some specifics of Catelyn's character now, and let's of course start with Catelyn and Jon. I tend to think most people's problems with Catelyn center around her relationship with Jon Snow. It's admittedly Catelyn's big flaw and probably the number one reason people hate her. And if you're expecting me to be like, here's why Catelyn's justified in treating Jon this way, no, I'm not gonna make justifications for it. You know what, I like Jon too. I don't condone Catelyn's actions towards Jon, and I'm not gonna sit here and explain them away. So how can I still like Catelyn? We're gonna get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of this specific point later, but in general I wanna talk about how all of George Martin's characters are very flawed. And it would be very annoying if Catelyn got a pass on that because we needed her to be the perfect mother. You might have one or two favorite characters you can claim are mostly uncomplicated good guys, but otherwise your favorite list is probably full of very complicated individuals, and Catelyn is no exception. It's why I love George's female characters so much. They're as complicated as anyone else because he just writes people. A theme you'll see in this Catelyn defense is that I don't always agree with Catelyn's decisions, but I can always understand them. I talk a lot in another video about when the phrase "it's historical" can be used appropriately in conversation. If you want more of my comments on that, here's the video. But right now, I do think it's important to talk about historical when we're talking about Catelyn's reactions. Catelyn didn't choose to be married to Ned. She was initially betrothed to his brother at age 12, and when Brandon died, then she was just immediately betrothed to Ned instead. She married him after never having even met him before. This, isn't unlikely. This was probably pretty par for the course. During my research for that other video, it was very common to betroth girls very young and then wait for them to get married later. And, often women, if not majority of the time, didn't have any say in who they were betrothed to. It was all about the benefits that would give the standing of the house or your name. And admittedly, in this situation, Catelyn was pretty lucky. She might have been betrothed really young, but she didn't get married until she was of age. And we all love Ned Stark, so it doesn't seem like it's a huge problem for Catelyn to be married to him. It doesn't seem like a huge burden. And from my personal reading of the story, I do believe Catelyn and Ned came to love each other. So it doesn't really seem like a bad situation for Catelyn overall, especially when we consider history overall and what could have happened instead with these kind of betrothals. That said, Catelyn still didn't have any choice in any of this. And so when we get to the rest of her story, marrying a stranger, getting immediately pregnant, then her stranger husband going off to war, and coming home with a bastard baby basically the same age as her trueborn, you don't think Catelyn's gonna have any resentment to that situation at all? Just like, this is fine? I think we can all admit that's pretty sucky. Now, does Jon deserve Catelyn's resentment? Of course not. He was a baby who didn't ask to come into this world. It wasn't his fault, and so of course he doesn't deserve Catelyn's resentment. But this isn't 2024. Where is Catelyn putting her resentment? She could put her resentment onto her husband, who she can't divorce. She can't get rid of. So she's going to have to put all this resentment and live a contentious and hard, difficult life. Or she can put her resentment onto a child and try to reframe the story so that she can love Ned and have a happy family life with him. That doesn't make it fair, and it doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable. In fact, this sadly happens today. We have all seen people in our life who incorrectly put the resentment on the child. Again, it's not correct, but it is a human emotion. She ruminates a lot in the story on the fact that Ned won't send Jon away. She talks about how bastards are often unclaimed or at least not living under a roof, so I'm sure that also increased her resentment. It's not charitable, it's understandable. And I just can't help think about how much less interesting Catelyn would be as a character if we removed this very significant flaw. If she just welcomed Jon with open arms and was a perfect mother to him. I'm not saying I would somehow suddenly dislike Catelyn, because I hate that decision of hers, but she'd be less interesting. And I think if we removed all of the sticky parts of our favorite characters, they'd also all become less interesting. Reread A Song of Ice and Fire, and I think one of the reasons it has become such a famous story is because of the flaws of all the characters. It's because of the way George writes the human condition. And this is a part of the human condition. And it's not even like Catelyn doesn't know deep down that she's doing something wrong. She admits it to herself. Catelyn had nothing against this girl, but suddenly she could not help but think of Ned's bastard on the wall, and the thought made her angry and guilty, both at once. She pushes the thought away because if she confronted her treatment of Jon and how unjustified it is, she'd have to deal with everything else, and she's running away from those emotions and has been for years. Now, you might say, but Jon wasn't even Ned's bastard, so she hated him for no reason. Yeah, that's the tragedy of it. That's the worst part. When you're reading this, you're already bummed out that Catelyn treats Jon this way, and then when you get to the end of the books and you put 2 and 2 together, you're like, oh, if only Catelyn knew. But that's not a reason for me to condemn Catelyn. That's a reason for me to be really depressed like the rest of the book series makes me. The story of A Song of Ice and Fire is people making bad decisions on limited knowledge. That's it. That's the story. Now, there are other events we obviously have to talk about vis-a-vis Catelyn as a character, but I wanted to take a quick break in that and talk about qualities I love about Catelyn and what drew me to her character that aren't just like her controversies. First, as related to what I said earlier, Catelyn is just a full person. Now, everybody in A Song of Ice and Fire is a full person, so it's not like that is unique to Catelyn, but as I stated, I very rarely see mothers with this kind of care and attention to their full range of who they are, and so it stuck out to me immediately. She has individual and different relationships with both her siblings, with her parents. And these relationships evolve and don't necessarily stay the same. We see her political maneuverings and what she values. She fiercely loves and protects her children while not having removed herself from that political landscape. She also has very individual relationships with each of her children, which is something that I don't actually think is portrayed as well as it is here normally. I think sometimes we'll see like the diametric of like love one children, hate one child, but that the fact that Catelyn has so many children and there's a unique relationship with each of them that isn't just negative or positive, I think is also a real testament to George's skill. Several of my favorite scenes actually involve that, and one in particular is a scene with her at Bran's bedside. Robb's voice softened. He's not going to die, Mother. Maester Luwin says the time of the greatest danger has passed. And what if Maester Luwin is wrong? What if Bran needs me and I'm not here? Rickon needs you, Robb said sharply. He's only 3. He doesn't understand what's happening. He thinks everyone has deserted him, so he follows me around all day, clutching my leg and crying. I don't know what to do with him. He paused a moment, chewing on his lower lip the way he'd done when he was little. Mother, I need you too. I'm trying, but I can't. I can't do it all by myself. His voice broke with sudden emotion, and Catelyn remembered that he was only 14. She wanted to get up and go to him, but Bran was still holding her hand and she could not move. So a few people have criticized this scene and talked about how it proves that Catelyn is a bad mother, and every time someone says that, it shocks me. This scene made me teary both times I read it, both the first time and when I reread it, because it was just such a real and raw scene. You are so lucky if you don't yourself or have friends who have gone through the situation of having a very sick or dying or otherwise child who has medical needs. I have had friends with that situation, and this is just like such a real portrait of that. These mothers are trying, they're not meaning to put so much focus on the one child, but that child has so much need. It is sometimes hard to feel perspective, especially if you think you are going to lose a child, to think you have limited time with them, can make it very easy and very human to make the mistake that Catelyn is making here. And I just read that and it was just such a touching scene. I, again, just couldn't believe how well that kind of difficult aspect was portrayed. Similarly, people have also criticized how Catelyn treats Sansa versus Arya. And again, so common, so common. Less common, I think, in families with less children, or it's harder, more difficult to see. But I do have a couple of friends that have larger families, 4 children and 5 children. And as a parent, you have very different relationships with all of your children, and you come with all these preconceived notions about what you think your children will be, and when they don't live up to that, it can be very difficult. Now, obviously, as parents, it's our job to try to get rid of that, but it is not always as simple as you would think it is before you are a parent, and I have seen this exact thing play out, and it wouldn't be no surprise that Catelyn, as someone who was raised the way she was, and someone whose life has gone the way it has, betrothed, and as I already explained, and how she followed that dutifully because it was her job, to see someone like Arya and be frustrated. If you read A Song of Ice and Fire and don't think Catelyn loves Arya as much as she loves Sansa, we are not reading the same character. Yes, she is frustrated with Arya all the time. She wants Arya to be more like Sansa because for Catelyn, that is her view of what a woman should be in this world at this time. And I hate that we punish Catelyn twice for it. We punish her for not fitting perfectly in the mold, and yet we punish her again for wanting Arya to fit a mold. Like, it's both. Like, she gets punished twice for it. Of course, in this society, she thinks Arya needs to act like Sansa because that is what she has been taught. And I again, don't see any evidence that Catelyn doesn't want Arya alive just as much as she wants Sansa alive. They just have a more complicated relationship, which, once again, nuanced and interesting. I also think people devalue Catelyn's historical knowledge and political savviness. Again, doesn't always mean her decisions are perfect, but she does actually have quite a bit of knowledge and gives good advice. And I'm gonna say it, she was right about Ned and Robert. She was right. Let's read it. "I will refuse him," Ned said as he turned back to her. His eyes were haunted, his voice thick with doubt. Catelyn sat up in the bed. "You cannot. You must not. My duties are here in the north. I have no wish to be Robert's hand. He will not understand that. He is a king now, and kings are not like other men. If you refuse to serve him, he will wonder why, and sooner or later he will begin to suspect that you oppose him. Can't you see the danger that would put us in?" Ned shook his head, refusing to believe. "Robert would never harm me or any of mine. We were closer than brothers. He loves me. If I refuse him, he will roar and curse and bluster, and in a week we will laugh about it together. I know the man." "You knew the man," she said. "The king is a stranger to you." Catelyn remembered the direwolf dead in the snow, the broken antler lodged deep in her throat. She had to make him see. "Pride is everything to a king, my lord. Robert came all this way to see you, to bring you these great honors. You cannot throw them back in his face." I think it's super strange that people often point to this scene as a way to blame Catelyn for Ned's death. Catelyn is 100% right in everything we see play out with Robert and Ned later in the story. We see the way Robert treats Ned and forces him to come back and tries his hand. And in fact, at one point, Ned even recalls Catelyn's words here and says that she was right. Catelyn had tried to warn him. "You knew the man," she had said. "The king is a stranger to you. The sooner he was quit of King's Landing, the better." If Catelyn had said, "You're right, Ned, you should stay in the north, tell Robert no," do you honestly think with how the characters are written, Robert would have let Ned say no? I do not believe so. I also think, with everything we know with what happened in Fire and Blood and A World of Ice and Fire, Catelyn's got some historical knowledge to back her up on this sort of "you knew the man, not the king." We also see this similar thing with Robb's letter in A Storm of Swords. And this is when Robb is writing that letter to Jon to make him an official Stark, like to make him the heir. Now, to be clear, I was actually very annoyed with Catelyn in this scene. It bothered me a ton that she was putting up such a fight against Robb because I was so excited that Robb was going to make Jon an heir. And in fact, if you've seen my other reviews, you'll know that this is like my hyperfixation of the thing we aren't going to get. It drives me crazy that we have no idea where that letter went and may never know. So again, I don't hate Jon. I was super excited by the idea of Jon being made like an official heir or whatever. And then I read A World of Ice and Fire and actually read about Aegon IV. Let's go first to what Catelyn says. Mother, there was a sharpness in Robb's tone. You forget, my father had 4 sons. She had not forgotten. She had not wanted to look at it, yet there it was. A Snow is not a Stark. Jon's more a Stark than some lordlings from the Vale who have never so much as set eyes on Winterfell. He is set on this. Catelyn knew how stubborn her son could be. A bastard cannot inherit. Not unless he is legitimized by a royal decree, said Robb. There is more precedent for that than for releasing a sworn brother from his oath. Precedent, she said bitterly. Yes, Aegon IV legitimized all his bastards on his deathbed, and how much pain, grief, war, and murder grew from that. I know you trust Jon, but can you trust his sons? Or their sons? The Blackfyre pretenders troubled the Targaryens for 5 generations, until Barristan the Bold slew the last of them on the Stepstones. If you make Jon legitimate, there is no way to turn him bastard again. Should he wed and breed, any sons you may have by Jane will never be safe. Jon would never harm a son of mine. No more than Theon Greyjoy would harm Bran or Rickon. Greywind leapt up atop King Tristopher's crypt, his teeth bared. Robb's own face was cold. That is as cruel as it is unfair. Jon is no Theon. So you pray, have you considered your sisters? What of their rights? Look, I'm not saying Catelyn doesn't have dual motivations here. Clearly by the way she talks about his sisters also having claim or whatever, that she's really, one part is motivated to not have Ned's bastard as an heir to Winterfell. Like, I'm not denying that. But she knows her stuff. Because when I read this, I was like, oh yeah, blah, blah, Aegon IV, who cares? And then I watched World of Ice and Fire and the absolute destruction that all of that led to. And it's like, she's right. Just because she had multiple motivations doesn't make her wrong. I find Catelyn to be very clever, and I think she often understands people. Something in Robb's tone troubled her. She smoothed out the paper and read. Concern gave way to disbelief, then to anger, and lastly to fear. This is Cersei's letter, not your sister's, she said when she was done. The real message is in what Sansa does not say. All this about how kindly and gently the Lannisters are treating her. I know the sound of a threat, even whispered. They have Sansa hostage, and they mean to keep her. And finally, just another thing I love about Catelyn is I just find her chapters to be some of the most interesting. I find the plot lines she's involved in to be fascinating. They're often some of my favorite. I find her viewpoints of different areas to be unique. Jimmy and I talked about this in that Parenthood Live, but her perspective of the siege from waiting for her son to come home from the battle, just such a more interesting and unusual way to experience that type of thing that's very typical in fantasy. I just like hearing from her perspective. Okay, let's talk about Catelyn and Tyrion, specifically when Catelyn kidnaps him, because this was actually something I particularly focused on during my reread because I was super surprised when everyone was talking about blaming Catelyn for everything. Like, the war starts because of Catelyn, it's because she kidnaps Tyrion. And I hadn't read it that way on my first read through, and so this time I was like, okay, I am taking my Catelyn goggles off. I know I love her, but everyone thinks that everything is her fault because of this kidnap moment, and I'm gonna read it with that knowledge, and I'm gonna be convinced of it. I wasn't. I read it specifically trying to be convinced that everything is her fault because she kidnaps Tyrion, and I just can't agree with that, so let's talk about it. To be clear, it's not a good choice. When I first read it and I was like, oh my gosh, she's kidnapping Tyrion, I wasn't like, you go girl power. But just, can we just think from Catelyn's perspective here? She thinks Tyrion sent a killer to murder Bran, and she tries to go unrecognized, right? The whole thing is like, she's freaking out when she sees him in there, doesn't want to be recognized. He sees her, calls her out by name, and she makes this snap judgment. She makes this quick judgment in the moment. Like, that's the realism of it, is she doesn't have our foresight and knowledge and just reading here in time. It's kind of like when you're playing a game show from your couch and you somehow know all the answers to Jeopardy, but if you were up there, panic would take in, you know? She panics. It's not a good decision, but she panics, and people act like, I don't know. I read that scene and I totally understand why she acts the way she does. And I think the way she goes about it is quite clever. I'm sorry to say, I do think she's very clever in this scene. And people are always like, I can't believe she thought Tyrion, like everyone thought, okay? Peter manipulated them. And she also knows she made a mistake because she talks about it several times. Let's read some. And yet, Tyrion betrayed no hint of fear. Could I be wrong, Catelyn wondered, not for the first time. Could he be innocent after all, of Bran and Jon Arryn and all the rest? And if he was, what did that make her? 6 men had died to bring him up here. Resolute, she pushed her doubts away. I believe the Lannisters murdered Lord Arryn, Catelyn replied, but whether it was Tyrion or Sir Jaime or the Queen or all of them together, I could not begin to say. Lysa had named Cersei in the letter she had sent to Winterfell, but now she seemed certain that Tyrion was the killer. Perhaps because the dwarf was here, while the Queen was safe behind the walls of the Red Keep, hundreds of leagues to the south. Catelyn almost wished she had burned her sister's letter before reading it. They might attack, Catelyn finished hard. It was your doing, yours, a voice whispered inside her, if you had not taken upon yourself to seize the dwarf. Like, she knows. She knows. She keeps trying to push the thoughts away because she's gone too far down the path. Who among us? Who among us hasn't done that? Okay, look. The war was a snowball. One of those fake things you see in cartoons with the snowball rolling down the hill, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I am not denying that Catelyn kidnapping Tyrion didn't add a significant amount of snow to that snowball. But I just don't understand why, like, in these conversations, it's always like Catelyn's fault only. Like, if we're gonna talk about the snowball, Jaime pushed Bran out the window. Okay, that was our real start there. Peter lied and said it was Tyrion. Well, I mean, Peter and Lysa killed Jon. I mean, that's okay. I forget that we don't get that reveal till later, but they start that, which then that starts this, and then Jaime pushes Bran out the window, and I'm just saying there's a lot of reasons that war was gonna happen. So it's just that we're only blaming Catelyn taking Tyrion in this moment just rubs me the wrong way. Again, I'm not saying it's not a contributing factor. And I know you guys are just gonna argue so much about this and you're not even gonna listen to anything else I say. I am just saying, like, I can't see this as the only moment in this book that causes all of these things. And I literally don't think you can say anything to convince me because I have several friends who believe it and they have tried to convince me and I just cannot see it that way. And just like the fact that they're saying this is also another moment that Ned's death is squarely on Catelyn. You guys all like to blame Sansa and Catelyn for Ned's death. Let me answer this question. Do you think Catelyn would have warned Ned against telling Cersei that he knew about her children? Do you think Catelyn would have been like, yeah, Ned, tip Cersei off? No. If Catelyn was there, she would have been like, yo, Ned, let's not do that. And if anything killed Ned, it was that. So let's start giving Ned a little bit of blame here. It's really Joffrey. Okay, let's talk about Catelyn and Jaime. I'm actually surprised more people don't talk about this being her worst decision. Like, objectively wild that she lets Jaime go. Again, another character moment I can't help but love, if not only because we get more of Jaime and his arc that slowly made me love him as a character when I thought I never could, but also just now we get desperate Catelyn. You know, in the first book, we get more politically maneuvering, more like hopeful, more planning Catelyn, just very normal. By the end of A Clash of Kings, we're just all desperation. She thinks all of her children are dead. She thinks Rickon and Bran have been murdered by Theon. And so she lets Jaime go with the hope that she could get Sansa and Arya back. Can you blame her? This is a desperate act from a desperate woman, and that's what makes it interesting. Arguably, in my opinion, her worst decision, like, totally undermines Robb, totally undermines what they're working for. So, like, if anything, it's surprising to me that this scene isn't the one people talk about hating Catelyn for, because, like, if you're on Team Stark, this was objectively a bad decision for Team Stark. This was a decision for a mother, and that's why it's interesting. I also want to briefly mention Lady Stoneheart in here as part of my Catelyn defense, only because I actually ignore Lady Stoneheart completely. This is just of my own opinion that Lady Stoneheart is not Catelyn. Like, I understand she is, but the Lady Stoneheart we see presented so far in our limited interactions with her do not seem anything like the Catelyn I personally know, which makes me think that the price for raising her from the dead so many days later is that she has been distilled to a few emotions that she used to have, probably revenge being a primary one of them. And so Lady Stoneheart to me is a shadow of what Catelyn once was, and I don't really feel that it is like Catelyn brought back to life. So any of Lady Stoneheart's actions, I don't really feel like the need to defend in terms of Catelyn, because when I talk about Catelyn being my favorite character died in a storm of swords, devastatingly, and this aftermath is fascinating and interesting, but not necessarily her, in my opinion. Now, if we get other books I might be, my opinion might change on that matter, but from what we've seen, that's how I feel about it. So lastly, the thing I want to talk about in defending Catelyn is a circle back to what I talked about in the beginning with Catelyn and Jon, which is this idea of, I can totally understand if Catelyn is not one of your favorite characters, but what I cannot understand is the visceral reaction I get from people by saying she is one of mine. When we look at my top 5 character list, I have not gotten pushback at all on any of my other top 5 characters. Maybe like a surprise that one is so high, like, oh, I'm surprised that they're that high on your list because we don't see a lot of them or something like that. But I never get any pushback. And so I'm not even going to talk about other popular favorite characters that I think have done a lot worse things than Catelyn. I'm going to only talk about mine because I know the fandom's reaction to my top favorite characters. And I want to particularly focus on Jaime and Tyrion. Let's just do a quick list of some of the actions these characters created compared to Catelyn's. We've got Jaime Lannister up first. He killed the king after taking an oath as a White Cloak, had an incestuous relationship with his sister and fathered incestuous children, attempted to murder a 7-year-old, just to name a few. Tyrion murdered his father, murdered his lover Shay, has raped people. And then let's get to Catelyn. And I'm not even going to try to mince words. I'm going to try to make her sound as bad as possible. She was emotionally abusive to her husband's bastard. She kidnapped Tyrion and set an important captive free. When you objectively look at that list, when we are ignoring all context, all but, when you look at that list, you're honestly going to stare me in the face and say that Catelyn is the worst of the 3 of them. You can't when you look at their direct actions. So my point isn't that you have to love Catelyn because she's somehow a better person. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's shocking to me that I had a commenter, it was only one, but a commenter say, you must be a bad mother because you like Catelyn. And no one's like, you must be a bad person who supports murder because Jaime Lannister is your favorite character. You mean to tell me that people don't believe I absolved Jaime of his actions? People aren't like, wow, you support that he has a relationship with Cersei because Jaime's your favorite. No one's saying that. No one's saying that somehow I'm like, woohoo, Tyrion, go kill those people. Somehow no one makes that leap. They understand exactly why Jaime and Tyrion are appealing as characters, and yet everyone pushes back on Catelyn. And that's where it doesn't make sense to me. Hilariously, the person who said, I must be a bad mother for liking Catelyn, told me their favorite character was Tywin, which, look, Tywin's not one of my favorite characters. I'm not gonna oblige you. That's fine. You guys can love him. That's fine. My point being, I do think there's a very fascinating disconnect here where people question a love for a flawed character when we ignore so many flaws in others. I know some of y'all's favorite character is Theon, and we can't forgive Catelyn for her treatment of Jon, but we can forgive Theon for the stuff that he did at the end of Clash of Kings. Like, I know we feel bad for him later. I get it. I don't think about that. It's just more my reaction to it. And for the record, I would much rather be Jon Snow with Catelyn as a stepmom than any of the Lannister children with Tywin as my dad, and I stand by that. Okay, that was my long defense of Catelyn Stark. They can never make me hate you, Catelyn. I love you. I think you are a nuanced, complicated character. I think you present an extremely interesting view of motherhood, and I am so glad George wrote you the way he did. And I just hope I helped you see her differently. Again, I am not expecting anyone to come away from this video being like, Catelyn's my #1 character now. But I hope you can maybe view her differently, understand why people may love her and not love her decisions, and understand why she is an important literary character in my opinion. Tell me your thoughts below in the comments. And if you're just gonna hate on Catelyn, that's your right. Doesn't mean I'm gonna respond or agree. Let me know if I made you think of anything differently, or if you already knew all this and you're like, doesn't change my opinion at all, you can let me know in the comments below. As always, if you like these kind of deep dives, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you wanna see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants or updates, you can follow me on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.